Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we're going to be focusing on specifically two regions in the American colonies, the New England region and the Chesapeake region. So this is an overarching view of life during this 17th century from 1607 to 1692. All right, first up we have to take a look at the Chesapeake region. Now, geographically, the Chesapeake region is what is Maryland and Virginia. It's very important that you understand that Maryland and Virginia are the Chesapeake region. And for settlers living in the Chesapeake region, Maryland and Virginia, disease was very widespread, specifically typhoid, malaria, dysentery. And as a result of this heavy amount of disease, the colonists did not face a very long life expectancy. Many of them died before the age of 20. In fact, half died before the age of 20 during the first part of the colonization experiment in the Chesapeake region. And so as a result, they didn't grow based on their own birth rate, meaning they constantly needed new immigration coming from the old world, England, in order to sustain this colony. They couldn't grow on their own. And the people coming to the New World, the Chesapeake region, mostly were young men looking to strike it rich. They wanted to make a name for themselves and they wanted to make some money. So the majority of these people coming to the Chesapeake region were men, so much so that by 1650 men outnumbered women 6-1, which, if you think about it, it's obviously very difficult then to maintain your population based on birth rate simply because there aren't enough women to go around. So this is another problem that the Chesapeake region faced aside from the disease. The fact that there aren't enough women to go around in order to sustain viable families. And so therefore the focus in the Chesapeake really isn't on creating families, it's about making money. And how are they going to make money? They were going to grow tobacco. We've already talked about John Rolfe and his assistance to the Chesapeake region by bringing those tobacco seeds. And very quickly, those tobacco fields were exhausted simply because there was such a high supply and also a high demand as well that people were just churning out tobacco plants year after year after year. By the 1700s, they were producing about 40 million pounds of tobacco every single year. And so because they were supplying so much tobacco, they weren't using all those agricultural models like crop rotation or leaving the fields fallow or whatever in order to allow the fields to regenerate some of those lost nutrients. So it was very difficult to maintain proper nutrition for these tobacco fields, but it didn't matter because they were making money hand over fist. Well, in order to continue making money, obviously these tobacco farmers and also the Virginia Company of London, that charter company that was making the money off of this colony, they needed a labor source. And specifically, at least in the beginning, the majority of this labor source was coming from poor whites from back in England using an indentured servant process, whereby these poor whites, and there was an economic depression going on back in England, people really had no choice. If they agreed to be a servant, quote unquote, for 4 to 7 years, they would receive passage and they would work for whoever paid for their passage to the New World. After their indentured servitude time was up, and they could be bought and sold during that period of time, but once their indentured servitude was up, they were supposed to receive food, they were supposed to receive clothes, and in some cases they were supposed to receive a small plot of land. The reality was that really didn't happen. But even with this indentured servitude process, the Virginia Company of London was really focusing on how can we bring even more people to the New World? How can we bring even more servants to the New World? So around this time they started offering a head right, or 50 acres of land for every person that came to Virginia or Maryland, or if you brought somebody over from England, you would receive a head right. So this is incentive, so to speak, to bring more people over. So for these people that were able to afford to bring more and more indentured servants over, they were receiving more and more land. And so very quickly, people were amassing large plantations, massive amounts of land in order to grow tobacco. And in these colonies, more land equals more money. And so very quickly we are seeing a division within society in the Chesapeake. The very, very wealthy and the very, very poor at the bottom. So by 1700, there were about 100,000 former indentured servants living in Virginia and Maryland. They were about 3/4 of the immigrants coming to this region. And life for them was very difficult. They faced poverty, landlessness, etc. by the time they reached their period of freedom. And so you've got these former indentured servants at the very, very bottom, and the very wealthy at the top who held all of the land. So this division within society is a breeding ground for a coming rebellion. People angry about having nothing when there are so many that have so much. This is an advertisement from the Virginia Company of London depicting how awesome tobacco was. So obviously trying to get people back in England to start smoking because it was so great. And this coming rebellion, very important, very, very important, Bacon's Rebellion. Now, the growing number of freedmen, because remember, after about 7 years or so, they received their freedom. For these, majority of them men, here they are, they have no land, they have no money, they have no prospects of getting any land or money. And there are no women who want to marry them, because why would you marry a former indentured servant when, you as a woman are in demand? So for these young freedmen, as they were called, they were pushed to the frontier, the back country, so to speak, because that's where land was available. And who did they encounter there but Native Americans? And so in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, a former freedman or a former indentured servant, led a group of about 1,000 angry former indentured servants and attacked the capital at Jamestown, attacking the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley. They were angry, number one, about obviously having no land, but they're very angry about the lack of Indian control on the part of the government. The government, they felt, was too focused on helping those who had money, those who had wealth and land, and not enough help with those who were living on the outskirts of society. And so during this rebellion, Bacon and his followers killed Native Americans, they ran the governor out of Jamestown, and they burned the capital down. Until in the middle of it, Bacon, like many of his compatriots, died of dysentery. And once again, like we've seen with other rebellions, without the leader, this rebellion was easily crushed by Governor Berkeley. Now, the reason Bacon's Rebellion is important, aside from it being this division between the wealthy and the poor, aside from it being this division between white versus Native American, we also see as a result of Bacon's Rebellion a push towards slavery after the fact. Now, other factors that can be accounted for with this, back in England, that depression that I had mentioned earlier was coming to an end. There were lower birth rates, so there were more jobs available. But really, people in the colonies at this time started to see the folly of their ways by relying so heavily on white indentured servitude. They needed a policy that ensured that people weren't going to get free. They weren't going to be free after 7 years and could thus not lead a rebellion against them. So we start to see more of a focus on slavery. And where are slaves going to come from but Africa? Because remember, there's already been an established African slave trade going on for years and years and years prior to this. They can utilize these slaves. They're not going to die from the smallpox like the Native Americans have. And guess what? If black slaves run away, they're easily identifiable. They don't know the land, they don't know the terrain, and they can't blend into the surroundings like Native Americans could. And so African slavery starts to become the focus of this new labor force in the New World, because they need a labor force to continue making money. Now, when it comes to colonial slavery in the New World, During the approximate 300 years, about 10 million African slaves were brought to the New World, 400,000 of them coming to North America. Now, obviously, the rest of them going to the Caribbean, or what's also known as the West Indies, because remember, down there, the West Indies is growing sugar, which is a huge cash crop down in that region of the world. They're making money hand over fist. But about 400,000 of them coming to North America, and that is spread evenly between the New England colonies, the Chesapeake and the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies as well. Now, aside from those rising wages in England, which I've already mentioned, and this fear of the rebellion, the Royal African Company in 1750 in the 1680s, lost its monopoly on the slave trade, meaning anyone with a ship could go to Africa now and take African slaves without being penalized by the English government. So when they lost their monopoly, or their sole ability to trade in slaves, it became open season on African slaves. And by 1750 in Virginia, as one example, African slaves accounted for about half of their population. Now, coming to the New World as these African slaves, that journey was very treacherous, very difficult. And this journey between Africa and the New World is referred to as the Middle Passage. So slaves were either kidnapped from the east coast of Africa, they were or sold by local tribes as a result of prisoners of war, whatnot, forced onto ships, chained at the bottom, and forced on this Middle Passage. 20% death rate among those African slaves as they came over, but it didn't matter. The more slaves they could pack onto a ship, the better, because there was more profit to be made as a result. So this Middle Passage was a grueling process in which many of them died. Now, at least in the beginning, about 1619, we saw the first Africans come to Virginia. But it's still unclear as to whether these African slaves or these Africans were actually slaves or indentured servants. There's a lot of historians who believe they were indentured servants and eventually received their freedom. But by about 1662, we see this division between what is an indentured servant and what is a slave really becoming more and more defined. For example, it was more based on the race more than anything. And as a result of the slave status becoming more defined, the slaves and their children could not receive their freedom, and they were owned for the rest of their lives and their children's life. And it is going to be based completely on race as a result. From here on out, there is no question about whether whites can be slaves. They can't be. It is a status reserved solely to Africans. Here you see this map depicting what's known as the triangular trade. This is obviously a much more in-depth process, but starting down here in the Caribbean, we see the growing of sugar. This sugar would be transported to the New England colonies where it would be converted into rum. This rum and other products would be sold in Europe and also into Africa. Africa would provide the slaves, and these slaves would then be transported back to the New World, and hence the term triangular trade. This portion right here is what we refer to as the Middle Passage. Now, what England got out of all of this is obviously the tax money. They also received these goods that were coming out of the New World, and they were supplying finished products. That's part of that mercantilism process that we've already talked about, that economic system where the mother country uses her colonies to provide economic support. This is a map depicting the best way to load more and more slaves onto the cargo hold in order to get the full amount onto the ship. This is an artist's rendering depicting this African slave coffle, transporting them to the coast in order to put them on ships bound for the New World. Obviously a grueling process and very dehumanizing. This is an advertisement depicting the sale of African slaves along with other products in the New World that we see 1753 being the time frame here.